Good evening. So tonight we are going to continue over our study over the life of Christ, and we still find ourselves right here in Matthew 18, which is where we're going to spend mostly all of our lesson this evening, is right here in Matthew 18, starting in verse, we're going to recap starting in verse 15, and then we'll move on down. But we are going to be talking a lot about... To recap, last week we talked about brothers sinning against you and what that looks like, how that should be handled, how we should maybe handle a brother or sister who is falling away, who is caught in something, and things of that nature. And so as you start in verse 15 of Matthew 18, I'll read it as kind of a recap before we get started on our lesson tonight. But it says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whoever or whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." So as a quick recap, this is something that I think all of us need to kind of regroup and rethink when we think about sin, issues, conflict, not only in the world, but also inside of a local congregation. This is something that if there is going to be maybe someone that gets upset or gets maybe a division or a split in a congregation, this right here could very easily stop or hinder, make those things maybe not happen. Notice the first step. If somebody sins against you, you go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. It's not something that you bring up and you say like maybe out here in the foyer where it echoes real nice. Great for singing. Terrible if you're trying to maybe talk about a sin that someone has committed against you, right? You're not doing it so that everyone hears you, and you're not trying to degrade that person. You're trying to do it in peace and love because you care about their soul, because you love them. And so if they don't listen whenever you go to them alone, then you would take it up with 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established. And it says at the end of verse 16, by what? By the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's by evidence. It's by people seeing things. It's by something that has actually taken place. You're not making speculations or anything of that nature. It's by evidence. And then it says, to start verse 17, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. Now, you have to hope that it never makes it to this point. You would hope the brother listens to when it's a one-on-one conversation. In the best case scenario, the brother or the sister listens right there on the one-on-one conversation, and then no one even has to know about it. Right now, there maybe needs to be, something brought before as a form of repentance or something like that. It's another, maybe another topic. But I mean, the idea is that you all can work it out, and then no one else even has to know about it. There doesn't even have to be any kind of bad mouthing about anybody else, no drama or nothing of that nature. And so if not, if they don't listen to one-on-one, they don't listen to you and a couple others, then you take it before the church. And if they refuse to listen to even the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector, is what it tells us at the end of verse 17. You have to think about during this time, how did the Jews view Gentiles and tax collectors?
The lowest of the low.
Lowest of the low, they're like the plague, right? Lowest of the lows. They wanted nothing to do with them, right? They were sinners. They were outcasts. They wanted nothing to do with them. They were lower than them. They would avoid them. Now, who is Jesus going to eat with here shortly? Who's Jesus going to find sitting up in a tree? Maybe someone that fits into one of these categories, huh? We'll say that here in maybe a month or so. But Jesus' salvation is open to everybody. But the point is here is if someone is refusing to listen, refusing to change, and they're kind of standing their ground, you take it before the church. If they still don't turn, they still don't see the fault. That's when you get into the term disfellowship, which some people use. It's really, you still need to be praying and you still need to be caring for that brother or that sister. That's not something you kind of push them out the door and you hope they just never fix it. You should still be trying to fix it, but you do as like elders or whoever else in the congregation, you have to protect the flock. So you can't allow one person's sin or one person's being stained by the world to affect the whole congregation, because then you could lose multiple souls. So you have to be protecting the souls. You have to protect your own soul as well as others. And then it goes into, remember verse 20. I'll cover this before we jump into the main portion of tonight. But in verse 20 it says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them." Now Dale, I believe it was this exact verse, was it not? Okay. Dale did this lesson maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago, maybe even longer than that, on I don't think that verse means what you think it means, but he said it in a lot cooler way than that. This is not saying that wherever 2 or 3, Christians are gathered, boom, there it is, right? You can't just have, some people use it as a way to maybe not attend church or not do this or do that. In this context, the last thing that was mentioned essentially was them going before the church. This is a congregational thing that is being spoke about. And so it really is hinting more at the fact that even if you have small numbers at church, you can still be powerful. 5 really, really strong Christians are a whole lot stronger than 100 really, really, really weak and divided ones that can't agree on anything. 5 can do a whole lot more. 1 or 2 Christians alone can be a great work in ministry, compared to 100 people all pulling different directions. So number does not define us, but our soul and who we are following, who we are obeying does. So as we go into the next part, Peter's going to ask a question, and you have to think about, in our last couple things that we've talked about the parable of the lost sheep, we've talked about brothers sinning against you, we've talked about the world tempting us to sin at the beginning of Matthew 18, starting in verse 7. Jesus has told us that if your hands or your feet cause you to sin, cut them off. If your eye causes you to sin, rip it out. He's really hammering in the fact, if there is anything that is causing you to stumble, if there's anything that is causing you or could cause you to miss salvation, get rid of it. It's not worth it, because you want to inherit salvation. You want to inherit heaven. So don't let those things slow you down. And so that's kind of the setting where we find ourselves in Matthew 18, starting in verse 21, for our main lesson tonight. And it says this, starting in verse 21, "Then Peter came up and said to him, 'Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?'" Now, I'm going to stop right there for just one moment. I love Peter coming up and asking this question. Does anybody have a thought or an idea why Peter may have asked this question based off of the old law? Outside of Dale.
Well, Jewish rabbis just said you had to forgive somebody 3 times.
Yes, someone got it. Okay. All right. So the rule, or the written law, or the oral translation into a written law, basically noted 3 times that you had to forgive someone. So notice what Peter is saying here. The standard was kind of forgiving 3 times. Now what does Peter say? What about 7? So he's kind of being a little bit generous with it, right? He's going over. He's like, Jesus is going to want us to forgive a lot. The standard's 3. I'll say 7. Surely 7 is a good number. That's more than that. And then Jesus basically plays off of that. In verse 22, Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times," or most of the other translations, as I just lost it, will say 70 times 7. And so you get into not just 7 times, but you get into a whole lot of times, which I thought I had everything down. I think it's is it 460? Am I thinking right? Or 480? Is that right? 490. Don't quote me on math. I was close. 490. I was looking at the wrong note. I put it down because I knew I'd mess it up if I didn't. Yeah. It's like if I was an auctioneer, I'd have struggled. But anyways, 490 times. And I think what's funny about that, if you think about if someone were to take that literally, say Sue has now sinned against me, I'm going to have to pull out multiple books and write down each one. And then the next time she commits another offense, I'm going to go back and be like, man, I forgot to number these. I'm going to have to go back and count. And it would just be impossible. I mean, you'd have to carry around just insane notes. I guess now we could keep them on our phone. We could make an app for it. And we could track it. Dale would, it'd like a little clicker. I'm just kidding. But the point is that there's not really a time frame for it. If that person is repenting, if that person is sorrowful for what they did, if they're trying to change and they're trying to grow and all those things, there's not a number on that. Think about if Christ put a number on ours. What if Christ said, "I'll only forgive you 3 times"? Anybody here still in good shape? Anybody here sinned more than 3 times? right? None of us would be in very good shape if that was going to be the standard. Even 7 times, even 490 times. If you live you could probably give us a couple years, we could probably knock out 490, unfortunately, with all the things that we can go on in the world and thoughts that we could have and all these different things that we could say or do or something of that nature. The point is, though, is that Jesus wants us to forgive, and he wants us to forgive our brothers, and he wants us to be united. And that's what we're really going to see throughout this entire lesson. And there was 2 verses that I wanted us to kind of compare it to as well. And you don't have to turn here, but in Luke 17, verses 3 through 4, it says, "Pay attention to yourselves." Now, I like this. It's not paying attention to others. Pay attention to yourselves. "If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him." Notice there's things that have to happen, right? If they're not going to repent, then there's a whole different scenario that we need to follow. But he said, if he repents, forgive him. "And if he sins against you 7 times in the day," right? So not just in a year or a lifetime, in a day, "and turns to you 7 times saying, 'I repent,' you what? You must forgive him." It's going to the point that if someone is truly repenting, we need to be forgiving him. Another verse you could even look at would be Colossians 3, starting in verse 13, where it says, bearing with one another, that's something that all of us need to be doing in the church. "And if one has a complaint against another, forgive each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive." Why do we need to be so forgiveful of our brothers and sisters? Because Christ has been so forgiveful of us. If you want to try to keep tabs of it, how many times have you sinned that you want Christ to forgive you? In retrospect, that's how many times you need to be forgiving another brother or sister. It's too many to keep count of. If someone here knows how many times you've sinned, either it's been a very, very low number or you're way better at math than I am. Kathy?
I've learned in my life that sometimes, we say, I can forgive, but I can't forget. And really, that's true. I mean, we're human, and we would like to be able to forgive, but that's not possible. And every once in a while, we can kind of put it in the back of our minds. But I've learned that sometimes when something creeps back up into my mind, where I've been hurt by somebody or something, I just have to, I may not be forgiving multiple things. I might be forgiving the same thing over and over in my heart when it creeps up, and I tend to dwell on it. And do you know what I'm saying? So I may just have to go, okay, no, I forgive, and I just have to remind myself, okay, I'm forgiving, I'm still forgiving that, I'm still forgiving that. So I think that's kind of what Jesus understands us, because he was human, just like we are, and I think he's getting that point, because God can obviously forgive once and for all. He can just say, okay, I forgive you. But we have a hard time with that. It's a struggle, and we need to remind ourselves
Yeah, and I would even say too that if we're a Christian and we're obeying, we will be forgiven. I don't think it's a stretch to say it's not forgotten. If it was forgotten, then why send Jesus? It's just not counted. And I think there's a big difference there. He's not going to count it against us. He's not going to hold us against it. But what does it even say in Romans? All have sinned and fallen short. I mean, it's known. And I think one of the things that we have to think about on the flip side of this, maybe we're the person that's sinned 7 times against someone. Maybe we're the person that needs to be being forgiven. We can't forget that when we commit something against somebody, it could take time. They may forgive, but it may take time for them to even heal from that. And so you can't just be, no, you got to forgive me, and we got to be just like we were. Sometimes our sin can have a domino effect. It can have multiple layers to it. I mean, you could change people's lives by sins you commit. Think about a DUI accident, and maybe you take someone's life. That family can forgive you. They're never getting that person back. It can be very hard. And so we have to understand that while something may be forgiven, we also still have to deal with the consequences. Jail time, whatever it may be, right? Maybe that person can't talk to us for a little while because it just brings up too much emotions. We need to be okay with that. We need to understand where they're at and still love them. I mean, it could take you multiple years to get back to even close to where you were. And that needs to be okay with us. We need to be forgiving them for them having a hard time trying to forgive us, honestly, right? But that's why it's all becoming a family. And there can be so many things that the church can be divided over that people just don't want to give up. Family members have hurt family members. This family didn't like this family. We had this, dispute years ago, and so we're still holding it out because you didn't agree with my, I don't know, whoever it was. I don't know. You did something to my parents or whatever, right? And we just we'll hold it against like the next generation. That's silly. All right? We have to be united front. The only way that we have to be united front, we're going to be forgiven as much as we forgive. And I think that is one thing that all of us have to remind ourselves of. And that's hard. That's not an easy thing. That's probably one of the hardest verses. That and pray and love your enemies. Both of those are just, you want to talk about a hard pill to swallow. Forgiving and loving and praying for your enemies, those things. But even forgiving as much as you want to be forgiven. That can be very hard. Mark? And I think sometimes too, we can get to the fact of I've tried to approach them and they just won't. They won't come to. They won't forgive. They won't apologize. Well, most likely, both people need to apologize. In almost most circumstances, not always, but it's kind of just a. I wish I had this chart. I'll have to go back and find it. But when I was at Faulkner, I forgot. I think it was Dr. Brenneman shared it. It was a book he made us read, but it was literally just a chart of basically how arguments and how things happen. And it literally just goes in a circle. Someone feels threatened, they attack, that person responds back, typically not in a good way, and then it just keeps going in a circle. And if you don't break the cycle, you just sitting there like a tire in a car going down the interstate. You just repeat. Dale?
I think pride gets in the way.
Yep.
And you think about, Jesus is talking here about forgiveness, but it wasn't that long ago that he had set a child in the midst of them and said, unless you're like, and you look at children that they'll fight over a toy and they'll be at each other's throat, and then 5 minutes later they're fine and they're playing together again, right? Because they don't have that pride issue. And he says, unless you're like little children, right? That's how we ought to be with regards to grudges. We ought to not hold a grudge.
Yeah. I think that's the biggest thing that we can see today. Sometimes we can hold grudges. Now, sometimes maybe there is a little bit of a personality conflict, and we need to be wise about that if we're going into certain, ministering scenarios. We need to know kind of good teams and stuff like that, but we also need to be working on that because we need to be striving in unity because we're trying to strive with unity for Christ. But we still need to be wise with things, right? It may take time to fix relationships. It may fix time to fix these bridges that maybe we've burnt down and broken. But the main point is that we have to find unity. That is one of the biggest struggles to why there's so many different denominations today. Why is there? Split. There's the same denomination right next to each other in some cases. I could throw a baseball and hit the other door from one. Kathy?
There's also something, from a teacher's point of view, I have to say, but, and I talked to the kids about this when I'm in class, but forgiveness is not synonymous with trust.
Yep.
Trust has to be built up and established. And yes, you try to work toward trust again. And even in a marital relationship, when trust is broken, it takes time to build back, and obviously you want to because that's your mate, right? But trust is like, I always describe it like a vase that's broken. Can you fix it? Yes, you can glue it back together, and it might take longer depending on how many pieces it's in. Is it gonna be ever the same again? No. Is it gonna be more fragile? Yes. And that's the visual I give to the kids, but, you obviously you try to work back toward that trust, but you can't just always say, oh, okay, there's total trust. We should trust Jesus, not more than each other. Does that make sense?
I would think, I mean, it's kind of like a scenario where someone has lied to you, say like 1,000 times, and you've forgiven all 1,000 times. And then they tell you something on the 1,001 time, and you're like, do I believe that, or do you take a little bit of caution, right? You're like, I'm not putting full stock in that. You know what I'm saying? Because there has to be some trust there. It may take you a while to gain that trust. That doesn't mean you're not forgiving him. It just means that your yes should be a yes and your no should be a no, and they have not followed that. And so it can be hard to even trust that their yes is a yes and their no is a no. But it goes into us continuing to grow, and that's why every single day we should be working to grow closer to one another. It's another reason why we should be in fellowship with one another. It's more time that we can spend time together glorifying the Father. What better bond to build than lifting up songs of praise with one another? Right? That should be something that you would want to do. So when we get into this main lesson, it starts in verse 23. It says, therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Now there's a little, I did some math. I had to factor in some inflation. This is a roundabout estimate. No one rip me on this one. If you look back at some of the older commentaries, they got a less number. I factored in a little bit of inflation. So assuming that this is a silver talent that is mint, it would be about 15,000 per talent, which would mean the debt would be 150 million would be this person's debt. That's a lot. Now, some of the older numbers are closer to like 40 million if you go back and look at some of the older commentaries and you start looking at what they say it is. If you factor in some inflation, it's about 150 million. If it were a gold talent, it's about 20 times that. So whatever that math is, knock yourself out. It's a lot. The point is you're not paying it. And he says, so that's the end of verse 24, and it says, and since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. You're not paying that. No one is paying that. That's, 16 million in today's money. I'm not just pulling that out of my checkbook, right? But he's imploring him. He's saying, no, I'll do something. I'll do this. I'll do that, right? I'll pay it all. But he says, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. Verse 27, it says, and out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. So he forgives him. But then in verse 28, but when the same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Going back on the math, that's about a day's wage, which is about $8. If you do 100 of that, you got about $800. So think about 16 million to $800. $800, I'm feeling a little bit more confident we can pay off the debt. More people can pay that, right? 16 million, not so confident. So this person owes him about $800 in a day's time. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. Now, when you look at these two scenarios, the first one I think is very easily all of us. $16 million. I don't think anyone here, unless I'm going to be surprised by someone sitting on a whole lot of money that I don't know about. $16 million is something I ain't paying in my lifetime, most likely. Let alone if you take in inflation when I get, in another 20, 30 years. I'm really not paying whatever that amount comes out to be. The point is that our sin in our life can be so great, we can't pay it. No one here can pay for the sins that we've all committed. Only the blood of Christ can. And so we can't even pay for our own debt. So here we are pleading with the Father, have patience with me. I'll pay you. We can't pay that debt. We can't pay it. The only way that we can pay it is by contacting the blood of Christ, because the blood of Christ can pay it. It's the only way we can pay it. And even then, it's not even us paying it. We've just got kind of a middleman that's going to be the person that stands in before us. And so we ask for that forgiveness. I've used this example numerous times. This right here is a perfect story of us praying to the Father, asking for forgiveness, and then turning around and not forgiving the brother right behind us that has done something so much smaller. Right? We've done something crazy. We're asking for forgiveness. This brother back here has done something minor, and I can't forgive that. I can't do it. But yet we expect the Father to forgive us what we've done. You see the contradiction here? This can happen in our life if we're not careful. Notice also the differences here in the master. The master is going to collect his debt. Does the master go around and choke people until they pay their debt? Demand them to pay their debt? He calls them up, right? It's kind of the scene that it seems like we're given. And he's calling his servants to collect it. But notice what it says in verse 27. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. If you go back to when Jesus walked on water, back in, was it Mark 6, I want to say? He showed compassion. It's something that Jesus does a whole lot of if you start looking through the life of Christ. Jesus showed compassion on them. Jesus likewise will show compassion and forgiveness on us if we've done what we need to be doing. If we've contacted the blood, if we've followed after him, he will have pity on us, you could say. So he forgave him his debt. Notice, though, that the servant that was forgiven goes out, and he doesn't act nearly like the master. It's anger, it's rage, it's something so emotional. Choking the person, asking for the money. And notice that he says, so his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him. Was that not the same exact thing he did? Asking, pleading for forgiveness. Yet what? What was the difference? He says, have patience with me, I'll pay you. Same thing. Verse 30, he refused and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. Now, who here really deserves prison? Person who owes $16 million or $160 million, whatever it was, or $800 in today's money? Well, one, it sounds like someone has robbed multiple banks, and the other one, it sounds like someone's behind on maybe it's a car payment now, I don't know, maybe not quite a mortgage, but they owe like a lot smaller amount. So he's going to put him in prison until then, and then notice what happens in verse 31. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Notice that the fellow servants notice what's going on. They notice that something is not right. They notice that this is not what needs to be happening. Now, they probably should have went directly to him at the start, and maybe they did, and we're just not told that. But it says that they go and they take it to the master. And so then in verse 32 it says, then his master summoned him and said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should you not have mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? You can circle, highlight, underline, put a little note next to it. I hope none of us hear this verse on Judgment Day. When you think about what the end of this passage is going to say, we are going to be forgiven as much as we forgive. I don't know how much forgiveness anyone here needs, but I know I need a whole lot. Therefore, I better be dishing out a whole lot of forgiveness because I'm going to need a whole bunch of it from the Savior. We don't have time for grudges. We don't have time for drama and disputes because we have souls to save. It's not about whether you and another brother or sister disagreed on what color the carpet should be or what we should have for the potluck. It doesn't matter because what matters is saving souls and getting to heaven. It's not about you, it's about the soul, and it's about praising the Father and bringing glorification to Him. And when we start getting stuck in these disputes and, I'll sit on the other side from you or whatever it may be, I don't know. I'll sit in a different pew, right? We get in all these different silly things that we can do. We're making it about us. And it doesn't need to be about us. It needs to be about the Father. Why would anyone want to come to your local congregation if you all can't even sit next to one another? Does that sound like a congregation people in the world will look at and be like, man, that looks like a friendly and loving place. They can't even sit next to one another. Shame on us if we have that happening. And if we do have it happening, good news. We can change it today. It don't have to be that way. If you've got something with a brother or sister, go and fix it. If you know a brother or sister has something with you that's not been corrected, go and correct it. Because the day is too short. The days are too evil for us to stand divided. In fact, we're not going to stand divided. We have to stand united and united with Christ. We are a family. A family does not need to be fighting with one another. A family needs to be united, and we need to be lifting up. We need to, I've mentioned this the last couple of weeks, the world is watching. The world's always watching. I always make the joke about people rubbernecking on the interstate to see if they're getting a ticket or what the wreck looked like or whatever it may be. The world's always watching, and the world is watching us to see how we handle things. Sometimes the world is going to poke you because they know that you proclaim to be a Christian. So they're going to see if they can't cause you to maybe not act like a Christian or whatever it may be. They're going to see how you respond, see how you handle situations. Well, if they're going to be watching us, we have a chance to show them a Christ-like life. So let's do that. Let's be the united front that the world looks at and be like, well, those people are different. Why do those people seem to always get along even though I know they have disputes? Why do they keep showing the forgiveness to one another? I want to be part of that. Because when we stand united, when we're a loving group, when we can sit next to our enemy, whatever you want to say, when we welcome our enemies in, we've prayed for them, and now they've made some kind of change, and now they want to come and be in the fold, they want to have a life in Christ, and they're sitting next to us, it's a beautiful thing. It is a beautiful thing. Life is too short, and the soul's eternity is way too long to hold things like that. So as we continue in verse 33, it says, should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. Well, it's a lot of money to pay, ain't it? And he's got to pay all of it now because of what? $800.
You can't make money in jail.
Yeah, I can't. I guess they pay you a little bit. Right? They get a little cheap money if you work the little side labor, but you ain't getting $800, are you? No, it's a point. The point of it is, you had been forgiven so much, and you refused to forgive something so small that now you're going to be held liable for all those bigger things that you know you can't pay. You have the blood of Christ right there, but you're not even wanting to share the forgiveness that Christ has shown you with another brother or sister. So now you're going to be held liable. You're forgiven as much as you're forgiven, as we can see in verse 35. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from what? From your heart. See, it's not emotional. It's not an outward show. It's not just an outward expression, right? It's like a brother and sister, I guess, sitting at like a, we'll say Cracker Barrel. I don't know why Cracker Barrel. They're sitting at Cracker Barrel. Boy, they're just sitting there picking at one another, poking, kicking, all these things. They're not getting along, right? They're sitting there having these little arguments, right? It ain't like that. It's not something where you're just like, your mom yelled at you, you're like, oh yeah, we'll act right like we like each other at this moment, right? It's not that. You're forgiving from the heart. It's something so much deeper. It's not something outward. It's going to be outward. It's not just an outward appearance, though. It's not just putting on a show so other people see it. You're not just trying to check off the boxes. It's from the heart, and so is our worship, and so is our prayers to God, and so is all of those spiritual things. It's not physical, it's spiritual. And so you're forgiving from the heart. But notice the tragedy in this. It says, so also, notice he just got thrown into jail in the end of verse 34, and it says, so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother. So what happens if we don't forgive one another? I don't think we think about this enough. I know we don't think about it enough. It ain't talked about enough. What happens if we don't forgive one another? We let these strifes divide up the congregations and the churches. We won't be forgiven. It is black and white. This verse right here, you can even look at the Lord's Prayer in Matthew. You start looking at the Sermon on the Mount. You go read the Sermon on the Mount. We are forgiven as much as we forgive. If you don't want to forgive other people, if you don't want to show grace, you ain't gonna like Judgment Day, and I won't like Judgment Day if I follow in that step. Don't mess up Judgment Day because you can't forgive a brother that's asked for forgiveness. Mark?
This is just me, it's not the Bible here. An opinion feel as if it is easy to say, I'm sorry for a person, then likely it will also be easier for a person to say, I forgive. In other words, you can be on both ends of it. There was a lady in Minnesota whose son was killed, murdered. The man who did it was put in prison. When he served his sentence, he ends up moving next door to the woman whose son was murdered. She hugs the guy, and everything, she forgives him. And I mean literally forgives him. And basically she says, and this is a really hard one for me to see myself doing what she did, but she said, well, I will never get to see my son graduate from college, but I will get to see him graduate from college. He was in college, I think. I never got to see my son marry, but maybe someday, if he marries, I will get to see him marry. They have a mother-son relationship with the guy who killed her son. Now, that's as close to the hardest thing that I could ever imagine. But I feel as if there is a relationship for an individual that if it's easier than most people to say, I'm sorry, it will also be easier for that same person to say, I forgive. They seem to be related things.
Yeah. And if it's the same story I'm thinking of, I actually used it in a sermon maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, during the closing remarks, the mother actually came up and did a very, very heartfelt, it'll bring you to tears, what she said. And you want to talk about showing forgiveness. And even think about you want to talk about what example she was following? What did Jesus say?
Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Father, forgive them.
Yeah.
And there he is dying. He's about to be pierced right in the side. You think about Stephen. Think about what Stephen said, think about what Jesus said, think about what this lady said, and then we're like, yeah, but they said something mean 25 years ago.
And think also about Saul, who becomes Paul.
Yep.
He has to meet Jesus himself on the road to Damascus, and he's forgiven. He had to forgive himself in those 3 days, and think about what he had done.
Yeah. There's just a lot there, and I think Mark brings up a good point too. Throughout our life, we're going to be on both sides of this. We're never going to be the always asking for forgiveness, and we're never going to be the always trying to forgive. We're going to be on both sides of it. There's going to be times where we make mistakes that we need to be asking for forgiveness, that we need to be apologizing. Those need to be heartfelt. Those need to be coming from the heart as well. Why go up there and apologize and waste your breath if you don't even mean it? Right? You're not doing it for show. You're doing it because your soul has an eternity. Their soul has an eternity, and you're trying to be united. And that's what it all comes down to. Life is more than life, if that makes sense. Life is a whole lot more than how many years you live your life on earth. Life is about where you spend eternity.
And sometimes really it's beneficial to forgive when the other does not ask for forgiveness, does not even ask.
Did Jesus do that?
Yeah.
I think Dale mentioned it at the beginning. There was already a sacrifice made from the foundation of the world. Now, we got to ask for it. But when we ask for it, he's like, yep, done. Worked on it from the foundation of the world. There was a plan put in place for this moment. Now, you still got to ask for it. You still got to follow some steps, but the sacrifice has already been made. The world goes on for 1,000 more years. The sacrifice has already been made for those folks. Now, you've got to take hold of it, but the sacrifice has been made. So we need to remember that we're going to be on both sides of this, and we need to remember that this does play a role in our eternity. And I don't think we think about that enough.
And if you don't forgive, your lack of forgiveness can end up ruling your life in the bitterness that you have inside yourself.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think sometimes we can be too prideful, as Dale mentioned. that we will want to hold on to something and not forgive something out of pride. And then that will essentially consume our life at some point. And then it can affect a whole slew of things down the road that we don't intend for it to affect. And we're allowing it to bring down our life when life can be so great. We can be so free in Christ, yet we're basically putting chains on ourselves and limiting ourselves by something trivial when the soul's at stake. And when you think about that, it's a hard teaching. It can be very, very negative, because if we're not forgiving our brothers, this is very negative. If we're not forgiven, we need not to be confident that we're going to be forgiven. If we want to show a lack of forgiveness, you can be confident that you might be as well showing a lack of forgiveness, especially based off of this verse right here. If you don't want to show forgiveness, why is the Father going to forgive you? But it doesn't have to be negative, because as a Christian, you have the opportunity to be set free. As a Christian, you have the opportunity to forgive like Christ has forgiven you. When you look at 1 John 5, it says, "Everyone who believes that Jesus Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves whoever has been born of him." We love one another because he first loved us. Verse 2, "By this we know we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are" what? They are not burdensome. Boy, this sounds burdensome, doesn't it? I got to pray for my enemy. I got to forgive people. It can be burdensome. It shouldn't be. Verse 4, "For everyone who has been born of God," what? "Overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God?" I guess you could be stuck in not forgiving one another. I guess you could be stuck in drama and division and just wanting to have strife with people. Or you could overcome the world, and it's right there before you. It all goes back, as I've been saying, to overcoming the world to our place in heaven. That's what all this comes back to. It's not for show. It's not just to make it look good in front of other people. It's loving from the heart, not only our brothers and our sisters, but also Christ. It's praying from the heart because we truly care about the Father, because we truly want that connection, because we truly have that connection. This world can be extremely hard. The world can seem like it's unovercomable. I'll make that word up. I don't know what word you would use. It's the first one that came to my mind. You can coin that one. We'll put that on a t-shirt somewhere. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, the world can be easily overcome because you have to accept Christ. And that can be hard for a lot of people. But once you accept Him, you follow those commandments, you live your life for Him, death has no more sting. And life continues on forever. You may have a physical death here, but boy, the next time you open your eyes, it's going to be awesome. Going to be awesome. Don't miss that because of a lack of forgiveness that we want to show other people. Don't miss that because you've just kept waiting and waiting and waiting to give your life to Christ. Don't miss that because you want to be too prideful and not follow His commandments. Don't miss that because someone in the world is dragging you down. It goes back to what Jesus said. If your hand is causing you to sin, cut it off. Feet, same thing. Eyes, rip it out. Don't allow something in this world to cause you to miss eternity in heaven. It ain't worth it. A job ain't worth it. The time you spend at your job ain't worth it. The friend group you have ain't worth it. All of it's temporary. Let's use our life to glorify the Father on our way home to the Father. So if you have anything on your heart this evening, if there's anything that you need to make known or you want prayers, maybe you need prayers to help to forgive someone. Maybe you need to make it right with someone. Make it right after worship if you have to. Call them, text them, do whatever you got to do. Take them out for coffee, lunch. Don't matter what it is. But make it right. All of us all of us need to be in the business of showing forgiveness because Christ has shown forgiveness to all of us if we've accepted His commandments. And because He's shown us such a great forgiveness, you as well have forgiveness if you want to contact the blood of Christ if you haven't before. You too can have a forgiveness, the ultimate forgiveness. And you can have a spot in heaven one day. You can't get any better than that. So if you have a need or if you want to accept the invitation, you want to give your life to Christ, you can do that as we stand and as we sing with Brian.